You can release your video order here. What does it mean?
Are we live or are we beginning?
No, he said that he would send. Estamos ao vivo. Okay, so I think I'll start. We'll start. Can we? Okay. Just. So, boa noite, good evening. I'm going to make this presentation in English, mas como sabem, essa palestra ela será em inglês, mas haverá, né, a tradução simultânea para aqueles. Okay. So, we are very glad and honored to have Jack Halberstam closing the first day of our Conversações seminars, hosted by the Graduate Program of Communication and Culture at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which this year has as its theme, Afetividades Comunicantes, Communicating Affects. Jack Halberstam is full professor, for those who don't know him, is full professor at the English department and the director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality at Columbia University in New York. He's the author of several books, among them Skin Shows, Gothic Horror, and the Technology of Monsters from 1995, about Gothic popular culture from the 19th to 20th century, which already points to his interest on outsides in mediatic culture, from Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Dracula by Bram Stoker, Robert Louis Stevenson and Oscar Wilde, to films like The Silence of the Lambs from 1991, by Jonathan Demme, and the figure of the serial killer. His second book, by Female Masculinity from 1998, is a pioneering work on masculinities redefined by lesbian subcultures. This interest was expanded in the Drag King book from 1999, co-authored with Della Grace Vulcano. As evidenced by his first book, historical perspective in his work always stems from issues of today, a theme that's approached theoretically in his book In a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives from 2005, an important contribution for historiography, archive, and space studies. Finally, not finally, but for me, is a very important book for me, for lots of people, The Queer Art of Failure from 2011, translated to Portuguese last year by SEP, as A Arte Queer do Fracasso, is also a contribution to the study of minor or sad feelings that are generally dismissed by activists. He also wrote Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal from 2012, and Trans, a quick and quickie account of gender variability from 2018. Perhaps his most personal work. Finally, last year, he started a double book project, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, is the first one, and the second book, The Wild Beyond, Music, Architecture, and Anarchy, that is going to be released this year. So I think this talk is about this last research that Professor Halberstam is going to talk to us now. Please be very, very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Denilson. Thank you to Aldo for translation and everybody for tuning in tonight. I was so happy that my book, The Queer Art of Failure, was translated into Portuguese. And obviously you can read that book, so I decided it's better not to present from that work, but I do want to say something about what this new book that I'm going to tell you about today and the book that has been translated sort of share. So in The Queer Art of Failure, I asked the question about what the relationship might be between capitalist metrics of success and, a kind of orientation to failure that could perhaps point to new forms of activism or different ways of thinking about the political. And I made the argument that queer people in many ways are cast as failures, and that many people who fall into the category of minorities or dispossessed or marginalized are also at the same time gathered together under the heading of failure. Therefore, failure offers us a very capacious way of thinking anti-capitalism and thinking it alongside queer logics of embodiment, as well as thinking with what I called in that book sort of immature modes of cultural production. So that was, in a way, a continuation of other work I had done on monstrosity, in which I again said, if monsters are the form of personhood that our society has deemed to be outside of the logic of the human, then maybe the monster offers us an opportunity to critique normative understandings of the human. So this is, in a way, this is the method that my work has proposed and has followed, which is to take the counterintuitive, often cast aside projects of modernity and see whether there's material within them to rethink some of the very tired and conventional binaries of human life. In my latest book then, Wild Things, A Disorder of Desire, I turn to a category that is most often associated with colonialism. And that category is wildness. Wildness is the other, in many obvious ways, to colonialism. The colonial forces, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the English in particular, the Dutch, the Belgians, went off, they thought, into the wild to find people who needed to be pulled into modernity, progress, and of course, capitalism. Therefore, I'm asking whether under the heading of wildness, again, we can find ways of undoing the colonial logics, discursive logics that trap us into certain formulations of progress, civility, civilization, development, all of those kinds of classifications that continue to propel neocolonial discourse. Maybe we can undo them by paying attention to everything that they opposed. And everything that they opposed gathers together under the heading of wildness. Wildness, however, is also where we find lots of different forms of queer and sexually excessive modes of being, desiring, and identifying. So once again, in a category that has been sort of rejected, we can find nestled within it perhaps some language and lots of questions on the way to, in this case, an anti-colonial politics. So that's the idea, and that there's a sort of, I wanted to give you a sense, a frame in a way, so that you could see how this work is connected to other work that I've done. And now I want to actually introduce you to the material that I cover in Wild Things. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I can find, yep. And here we go. Denilson, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay.
It's clear.
So this is a book. It's got a beautiful cover with an image by Asian American queer artist Candice Lynn, who makes gorgeous installations in which she thinks about the processes of colonialism alongside methods of preservation. This one is petrification, the way in which certain creatures have been studied and have been named and have been classified within the colonial will to know. And she creates these kind of fabulous worlds of objects and creatures and animals and forms of life that fall outside of this incredible, rapacious orientation to knowledge that became a kind of standard form of academic expedition and adventure in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Okay, so obviously a book called Wild Things, not so obvious maybe in a Brazilian context, but in an American context, an obvious reference point for a book that calls itself Wild Things is a beloved children's book called Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. And I'm going to read you a couple of pages from the opening of the book that deals very specifically with this children's book. And I don't presume that in Brazil people necessarily have read this book. So I'm showing you the panel. You can see how seductive the imagery is. The story is of a little boy who openly rebels against his mother, and because of his rebellion is sent to his room without his supper. He's so angry with his mother that he decides to leave, and he goes off on a journey that takes him to a place where the wild things are. And where the wild things are, he decides to make his new home, and they make him his king, their king. So he becomes king of the wild things, and they have a wild rumpus, and you think that now this is going to be the new home of the little boy, Max, which is the little character with the crown on here. But in the end, Max decides that he doesn't want to be in this place where the wild things are, and he ends up going home to his mother and making his peace with domestic life. So that's it. That's the whole narrative of the book. And now I'm just going to read to you from the first 3 pages of the book that go a little bit deeper into where the wild things are. And I'll give you another set of panels from the book. Okay. So in Where the Wild Things Are, Maurice Sendak's beloved book for children of all ages, we follow a young and untamed traveler as he learns the difference between the domestic world of the family and the wild world of lost and lonely creatures. This simple story of Max's journey maps the potential and the dangers of wildness. All at once, wildness appears in the book as a mark of exclusion, a place of exile, and it reveals the violence required to maintain radical separations between here and there, home and away, human and wild thing. So my book is exploring the wild then, not just as a space beyond the home, but also as a challenge to an assumed order of things from, by, and on behalf of the things that refuse and resist order itself. Wildness then names simultaneously a chaotic force of nature, the outside of categorization, unrestrained forms of embodiment, the refusal to submit to social regulation, loss of control, and the unpredictable. Now, this sequence suggests a romantic wild, a space of potential, an undoing that beckons and seduces. But obviously, the wild has also served to name the orders of being that colonial authority comes to tame, the others to a disastrous discourse of civilization, the racialized orientation to order, the reifying operations of racial discourse, wild things. For this reason, to work with the wild is also to risk re-engaging those meanings. But I take the risk here because wildness offers proximity to the critiques of those regimes of meaning, and it opens up the possibility of unmaking and unbuilding worlds. Okay, I'm going to stop reading, Aldo, just so you know, and I just want to say a little bit more about this book. And you can see these 2 panels here. On the right-hand side, you see Max, who has become king of the wild things. And on the left, you see him in the family home, chasing the family pet. And this is the panel on the left is really amazing because you'll notice that the little boy is not wearing human clothes. He's dressed as a wolf, okay? And he holds in his hand a fork. So he's obviously confused about the division between the wild and the human on the one hand, between wild animal and domestic animal on the other, and between pet and food, right? Is he going to play with the dog or is he going to eat the dog? And these are the kinds of distinctions that where the wild things are sort of threatens and almost seems to undo. The Max is, as a child, is the wild element in the family household. The family made up of mother, father, child is supposed to be a sort of stable, orderly form. But the child, in its proximity to the animal and in its orientation to a kind of chaos, is a wild element in the home. And so when Max then leaves the home and goes off to where the wild things are, he finds himself in the position of the parent over the wild things. Now, in that sense, Max becomes a kind of colonial traveler who goes off to meet the wild, becomes the king of the wild, and then leaves again to go home safe in his sovereignty. And so in many ways, it's also a very conventional story of becoming adult in some ways and abandoning childhood. So just to conclude this little reading part, at the bottom of page 4, Aldo, I'm saying, the wild, these two panels demonstrate, maps a set of relations between humans and animals, human representations of animals, animals in effigy, the stuffed dog, pets, family, world, performance, costume, nature, space, and temporality. My book asks both where the wild things are and when the wild things are. It provides few answers, but many questions. Some of the questions posed by Sendak's classic story have been asked before in other mythic tales about young adventurers and wild creatures. And so, in other words, where the wild things are is, is in a way a version of other stories like Burroughs' Tarzan or Kipling's Just So stories that serve to conform an imperial order of things within which the domestic and the wild are not simply markers of the proximity to home, but also serve a racial system within which wildness represents a time before, a primitive past, an unrestrained temperament. So I'll stop reading there, and that's just to give you a sense of where my title comes from and the orientation of wildness towards animals and children, and offering up a kind of antagonism to domestic stability. I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'll just go to I will talk through the rest of the book to give you a sense of how the book then plays out these both oppositions and continuities between home and away, here and there, colonial, metropole, and colonized margins, right? Obviously, wildness is a part of that exact colonial mapping. So as you can see from the reading that I gave, wildness is a concept that is inherently contradictory, multi-directional, and capacious. And the reason that Where the Wild Things Are is such a great story and people love it so much is because it is a kind of allegory for this incoherence, the way in which the domestic is supposed to be completely separated from the wild, and yet the family pet and the child represent fragments of the wild that are embedded in domestic order. Even in Where the Wild Things Are, wildness serves as both a promise and a trap, a colonial inheritance, but also a source of anti-colonial refusal. So as we could see in those panels, Max is a child, an animal, a pet. He is domestic subject, and he also rebels and then finds that anything that we might understand as domesticity is propped up by other locations where people who have been ruined are located. Max becomes a ruler of the wild things and then finds that domination is not wild at all. And so he, of course, wants to leave. In this sense, I mean, you could think of any number of colonial stories like A Passage to India or like A Heart of Darkness. These are all exactly this story. The traveler goes to where the wild things are, finds that the chaos that he finds there and the ruination is so disturbing that in the end, he leaves to go home and become master in his own home. But what of the wild? That's what these stories don't tell us. They tell us how to conquer the wild, how to overcome the wild, how to infiltrate the wild, but they don't tell us what wildness is. So what I'm going to do is try to lay out through descriptions of the chapters of the book why we would want to investigate more closely wildness, given that it seems like a category that has been so ruined by colonial discourse. What possible use could we get out of it still? So I argue that wildness is not exhausted by its function in colonialism, okay? Because think about it, wildness is quite an appealing category. When we think about things being wild, we think about the relief of not always being tucked in, being under control. We think about a kind of pleasurable chaos. We think about as the title of my book implies, a disorder of things that clearly lies beneath this incredible colonial will to know, to name, to order, to bring home to the colonial metropole all kinds of bits and pieces of the rest of the world that will now simply be embedded into an imperial logic and an imperial mythology. So the question is, can wildness be used to oppose colonialism on the one hand? And on the other hand, what about desire? How do we always, in the end, when we think about wildness, have at the back of our minds some sort of conjuring of sexuality and desire? All right, so let me begin by walking you through, and I'm not showing my screen the whole time because I'm trying to save the battery on my computer, but I do want to show you this one image of Roger Casement. My first chapter is on this guy, Roger Casement, and he's a perfect sort of example of the difficulty of extracting wildness from colonialism, but also the way in which desire is embedded in the category of wildness. So I don't know how many people know who Roger Casement was, but he was an Irish diplomat who worked for England at the end of the 19th century. And his role in English colonial management was to go to the Congo on the one hand, and on the other hand, to go into parts of Colombia and see how the colonizing occupiers were conducting themselves, and oversee, if you like, colonial rule there. So he went off into these very colonized places, and what he saw was shocking to him. Obviously, what he saw was brutality and violence. He saw colonial forces basically butchering and slaughtering natives in the Putumayo region and Black people who were cast as savages in the Congo. So what Roger Casement did was he came back to Europe and he insisted on an international tribunal that would look into colonial excess and form a non-national, supranational form of law that would take to task colonizers who basically committed violent acts against colonized peoples. So in many ways, he's been cast as the father of human rights, which is a mixed legacy in many ways, but that's how he's understood. So that's sort of the nice part of the story. Then in 1913, Casement comes back to Europe and he decides that Ireland, his country, is the Congo of Europe, has been colonized by the British, and he wants to take up arms against the British. So the very people he's been working for, he now wants to oppose. So he went to Germany in 1913 and he visited the German government and said, you should go to war with England, and I'm going to have Ireland join you because we want the British out of Ireland. And so off he goes. And the Germans, sadly, turned him in and handed him over to the English, who put him on trial for treason. Now, at this trial for treason, these diaries, called the Black Diaries, came out. The British government found his diaries, went through his papers, and found records that Roger Casement had kept of all of his sexual encounters with Black and brown men, particularly in the Putumayo region. And they used them in a homophobic context against Casement so that the Irish did not come to his aid. The Irish nationalists abandoned him, and he was hung on the charge of treason, 1916. And ever since, his legacy has been very confusing in queer studies, because the question has been, and I'll stop sharing my screen, who is Roger Casement? Is he a gay hero, or is he a goat? Is he the person who wanted to bring colonizers to justice? Or is he the person who sexually fetishized Black and brown men, paid them for their sexual services, and then entered them into history in his diaries as simply fetishistic accounts of their skin color, the size of their genitals, and the kind of sex act that he engaged in with them? This is a very complicated legacy, and it is that kind of legacy that comes out of the category wildness. And my goal is not to tidy up that legacy and say Casement is good or bad. It is to say that the legacy of colonialism is this very ambiguous terrain where you get a gay man going into the so-called wild, helping himself to sexual favors, but then coming out believing himself to be a good and righteous person, despite the fact that he has engaged in much of the same behavior as the colonizers that he came to accuse of breaking the law. And that's the legacy, that's the ambiguity and the difficulty and the tangled historical legacy that we are in relationship to in the category of wildness. Okay, let me give then, in relationship to that narrative, and I'd be happy to answer questions about Casement in the Q&A, let me give you a few proposals then. First, and I've made this point already, but I want to make it again. Wildness as a category that we might want to think with is not, sorry for the traffic, is not exhausted by its function within civilizational discourse. And it is true that wildness is all over the literature of colonialism, but there's still something outside of the colonial occupation, let's say, a kind of spaces that cannot be known by the colonizer, discourses that cannot be interpreted by the colonizer, modes of being and interacting, forms of embodiment and desire that cannot be simply scooped up by colonialism and tidied up into familial forms of social interaction. So in a way, you could say that wildness forms the domain of a critique. And that critique is of something that we could widely call worldedness, the world that has been created by colonial rule. Okay, and there are many, many different people right now with different forms of critical theory that are critiquing world. Just the most obvious one would be in the US, Afro-pessimism, which is a group of radical Black thinkers who want to bring about what they call the end of the world, in the understanding that world is what we have inherited from white supremacy and colonial rule. So to oppose worldedness in many ways is to open onto the category of wildness, what is in excess of world. Okay, so second, and this is the point about, colonial exploration that I've been making but haven't really unpacked. Second point, wildness is a discursive force that underpins the order of things with a necessary disorder of things. Okay, so we read Michel Foucault's, classic study, The Order of Things. And we agree with him, many of us, that in the 18th century, colonial exploration, changed the way in which knowledge was produced, received, and circulated. And through the explosion of expert knowledge, he proposes an order of things came into being that was separate from the theological order that had previously defined world. Theological in a Christian sense, where there's a God, and then there's man, and then there's humans, woman, animals, vegetables, etc. In place of that great chain of being, the theological order of things, or a religious order of things, Foucault proposes that knowledge production under the heading of colonial expansion came to define an order of things. Okay, so my point is that if there is an order of things, there must also be a disorder that is outside of that logic. And there are many people who have set about investigating and exploring that disorder. And I'll just give you a few examples. Sylvia Wynter, for example, the great Black anti-colonial writer, has identified something that she calls the coloniality of being, or the way in which white colonizers produced knowledge about others that drew all of humanity into these hierarchical orders. Those hierarchical orders are what sustain white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia in our current systems. And therefore, that is what must be opposed. And Foucault says as much. He suggests that behind the order of things lies something that he calls an untamed ecology. Untamed ecology. This is a sort of system of disorder against which order comes into being. Okay, order, in other words, demands disorder, and disorder is then associated with indigeneity, Blackness, perverse sexuality, and colonized peoples. So in wildness, all of those things lie: indigeneity, Blackness, perverse sexualities, and colonized people. Therefore, we have the potential in wildness for thinking outside of the framework of identity in terms of a solidarity between people who've been pushed into the category of disorder. Okay, so a few more terms, because in many ways this book is an attempt to produce a different critical lexicon with which to approach some of the most stubborn problems in post-colonial societies. We need different vocabulary. The vocabulary we use is already a colonial vocabulary. Therefore, it behooves us, it is necessary for us to lay out new vocabularies that will offer different kinds of knowledge. So one term, what would that vocabulary look like, you're asking? Let me give you one term, and that term is bewilderment. Bewilderment. Bewilderment in English is a great word. Bewilderment. It means to become wild, and it has within it wild, but it also means to not know or to get lost. In its archaic form, it meant to get lost in a densely wooded place. So the wooded place is like the jungle, it is the wild, right? So again, this is very similar to arguments that I've laid out in The Queer Art of Failure. Sometimes the way through order is not knowing, is becoming bewildered, disoriented, and allowing that disorientation to take hold. So the way that I use bewilderment is to think about a kind of dynamic within modern culture by which archaic and indigenous cultures get swallowed up by modernism. Think of something like primitivism, where French and English artists went around the world and then painted images of the Black and brown people that they saw, right? This is primitivism. And this is a kind of casting of a primordial beauty onto an otherness that is stranded in time, and that time is the time before modernity, okay? Bewilderment, I argue, is a counter-appropriation carried out within Indigenous and Black aesthetics to take back what has been stolen, okay? And I just want to give you a good example of that. Oh, this is difficult, Denilson, because I'm going to run out of battery soon. If I have to, then I'll please be aware, then I will switch to my iPad. I think I have just enough to show you these last slides, because I want to show you the piece that I'm going to talk about, which is Rite of Spring. Okay, so Rite of Spring is a really good example of what I'm calling bewilderment. It was a modern ballet produced by, in fact, 3 gay men. Diaghilev, a Russian gay man who identified as a pervert in the parlance of the day. He identified as an invert at the beginning of the 20th century. Stravinsky, who was less queer, but was rumored to have had a sexual relationship with Diaghilev. And Nijinsky, a Russian dancer who was involved sexually with Diaghilev. And the 3 men produced this incredible cultural event in I always forget if it's 1913 or 1906. I think it's 1906. 13, Nielsen? Yeah, 1913, which, remember, that was the year, one of the years when Casement is about to be put on trial for treason. 1913, the same year in Paris, this incredible event happens that was only staged twice and then never again. And it's this incredible ballet that basically breaks all the rules of ballet, of French and Russian ballet as it had been formulated as this disciplined form of movement that was about gracefulness and straight lines. This ballet, which was claimed to be based upon folk dances in rural Russia, brought to the stage a Westerners' ideas of indigenous peoples. Okay, now, so we know that there's a story about the one and only performance of Rite of Spring in Paris, that the dancers were booed off stage, and this has been classified as a riot. But the actual riot was of white bourgeois people who did not want to see indigenous forms of dance taking over what they understood to be the grace and the high modern movement of ballet. So this has sort of been one of the centerpieces of modernism, and it has incorporated indigenous gestures and forms and ideas about the indigenous into its architecture. So interestingly, a contemporary artist, indigenous, queer, two-spirit artist, Kent Monkman, and here's an image of them, performed at an event in Toronto in, I think it's 2009. He performs something that he calls the Dance of the Badash. And this was explicitly an homage or a critique of this painting by George Catlin, who made a painting of what he saw when he was in indigenous lands, and said it was one of the most outrageous and horrific dances he had ever seen of an ambiguously gendered two-spirit person. And this is a very similar dance to what Rite of Spring was attempting. Okay, so Kent Monkman restages the whole thing, the Dance of the Badash. He does his own dance, and he stages it to a rewritten version of the Rite of Spring that was rewritten by Michael Greylock, who is an Indigenous Canadian person who re-scripted the music of Rite of Spring. So here you have bewilderment. This is bewilderment, where the modern absorbs the Indigenous, and then the Indigenous queer two-spirit artist answers back and takes back that material, reperforms it, and changes again the language of the ballet. That's what I mean by bewilderment. Okay. Okay, so a few other words in the vocabulary. Denilson, would this be an okay time to switch to my iPad? Because I don't need any more images. Is that all right? I'm going to try. See if I can come on here. You might have to let me in, okay? You let me in and I'll get off from here. Okay. All right. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, we did it. Yeah. All right. So, so there we have, this kind of anti-colonial response to the languages of colonialism, much of which can be gathered under the heading of wildness. I just gave you an example of a classic modernist text, a ballet, that breaks the colonial form. Even, the Stravinsky-Nijinsky version is already an incredible work that completely breaks with the language of ballet. But in doing so, it does so by borrowing from what it understands to be these wild forms of expression embedded in indigenous cultures. And then here's another frame. Contemporary indigenous artist Kent Monkman responds with their own version of the rite of spring, and in that way completes this loop that I'm calling bewilderment, becoming wild once more. All right, so just to kind of conclude then, I'll just take another 5 or 10 minutes to tell you about the second half of the book and to round out this vocabulary of wildness with which we can pose a kind of anti-colonial, queer, and potentially racially specific critique of the lingering forms of colonial discourse as they permeate the culture and the politics of our contemporary life. Okay, so in the second half of the book, I'm very interested in the relationship between the human and the animal. And I have a chapter which sounds a little bit weird, but I have a chapter on a whole group of writers from the middle of the 20th century, mostly gay men, who wrote love songs to wild birds. Okay, so specifically, they wrote about falcons. Now, I don't know if anyone here today is a falconer or is engaged in falconry, but if you think about the instruments that are used in falconry, they're very similar to instruments that you might find in a gay man's leather bar. So when you're training a bird, it wears a hood. When you need the bird to sit on your arm, you must wear a huge leather glove. When you need to hold the bird, you hold leather straps called jesses. The bird itself is tethered to the glove, wearing chaps, leather chaps on its little legs. So it's got a leather hood on, it's got leather chaps on, and it's wrapped around the falconer's arm using leather straps. This is a deeply fetishistic art. Okay, so even that alone should indicate that there's an element of queer fetishism engaged in falconry. But there's more to it than that. So the next word that I'm offering up is ferox, F-E-R-O-X, which in Latin means wild or fierce. And I'm proposing in a chapter on falconry and on gay men who have written about falconry that we might think in terms not just of the epistemology of the closet, as Eve Sedgwick proposed, which is a very domestic kind of epistemological structure that you're in or out of. A closet is a room in a house, right? I'm proposing an epistemology of the ferox. And here the opposition is not between inside and outside, secret and open. The opposition is between domestic and wild. And I give the example, and there are many people who wrote narratives about hawks, okay? There's the Glenway Westcott was a young American author in the 40s who wrote a book about a gay man who goes to a party where there's a married couple, and the wife has a falcon on her arm, and he identifies with the falcon. He sees the married couple is domesticated, and he and the bird are the wild elements in the room. But then there's also a guy called T.H. White. T.H. White is a big figure in British lit because he wrote these Arthurian nation-building narratives like The Sword and the Stone, for example. But he also wrote a very interesting book in the 1930s called The Goshawk. And the goshawk is his love song to a falcon that he tried and failed to train. Okay. And when he was trying to train the bird, he wrote that he was most taken with the bird at the moment that the training failed, and the bird would return to a feral state. And he has this great quote. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it quickly. Yes, he suggests, I'm not going to be able to find it, but he suggests that he's been reading all of these books about falconry, and he learns that the falcon is a bird that you can train, but only for a moment. That bird will come to you as long as you have food. But as soon as it's eaten, it returns immediately to being feral. And feral, by the way, means untamable. You cannot permanently train a wild bird. It will always go back to the wild. And T.H. White at that moment says, what discreditable cord of alliances arrayed themselves behind this word, ferox. And then he proposes these words like fierce, fairy, fae, all of which are kind of gay words in some sense. And he says, this is what he identifies as. The category of the ferox is his category. Now, we know that there is no such category, right? In all of the classifications of the 19th and 20th century, including the gay, the hetero-homo binary, there is no category of ferox people. But here we have a writer who, through his identification with the falcon, finds himself completely and utterly identified with wildness. And there are a whole bunch of these guys. There's a great book by J.A. Baker called The Peregrine, in which he follows a bird around for 10 years and tries to become like the falcon. And those kinds of narratives suggest a completely different relationship to wildness, a relationship that is full of desire, and a relationship of envy, if you like, a relationship of identification that should clue us in to the fact that not everything is neatly collected under the binary homo hetero. Okay, so then the last section of the book, and I might just read a little bit from the conclusion to close, but the last section of the book says, okay, well, so if in the middle of the 20th century, people were very interested in falconry, and lots of people who we classify as gay men identified their sexuality through these wild birds, what about the pet, the family pet? Is that a place of wildness? Is the relationship that we have to our dogs, our cats, our birds, are those similar ways of trying to forge a relationship to the wild that has been completely kept at bay by the family home? My answer is no. The domestic animal is just that. We are not in relationship to the wild when we are in relationship to the pet, because we have domesticated the pet. And here I offer kind of a bit of a disagreement with Donna Haraway, who argues that humans and their companion creatures are constantly sort of training each other. And I'm saying, no, they're not. We train animals. We train animals to live in our household according to our regimes. We're in many ways simply incarcerating them and collapsing them into a form of life that I call zombieism, in which they have no reality outside of us. These animals are simply tethered to human schemes and human rhythms. And they then confirm for us that the wild is there to be conquered, to be known, and to be domesticated. And beyond that, I look at all of these narratives currently in circulation about zombies and suggest that the zombie is the contemporary figure par excellence for wildness. It cannot be controlled. It is a massing together of many different kinds of people who have been classified as living dead. And it is a force in the contemporary world to be reckoned with. So in that sense, I even offer the possibility that animals are organizing themselves against the humans, and at a certain moment will rise up and kill their masters. And that while we love to think of ourselves as revolutionaries, when it comes to the relationship to the animal, we, of course, humans are the masters that must be disposed of. So that's a kind of quick and dirty account of the book. Maybe that's a good place to stop, Denilson, and I'd be happy to read, but maybe that's not so necessary.
Oh, but that was great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know if we have questions. I have some questions by myself. Perhaps I can start to break the ice. One thing that for me was very, very curious at your book, at the beginning, at page 29, in fact, that when you make a kind of comparison between the dandy and a kind of a modernist, I don't know if it's the right way to call, the modernist dyke, no? So I wonder, in this part that you are talking about artificiality, that's Oscar Wilde in The Descent, that for those who don't remember is the author of a Rebus, that's in English has a very peculiar translation, that's against nature, that I think is much stronger than the original. But Oscar Wilde in The Descent found nature itself to be the problem. For this reason, perhaps modern readers prefer to arc dandy to the dowdy and gender-inverted dyke. Wilde's work remains part of a tried and a true canon of Western literature. In other words, while the well of loneliness is and remains a slightly embarrassing, if necessary, literary experiment. The dandy hates the system that hates him, and is bored by that which demands meaning, indifferent to that which intends to invoke passion, imposes himself ahead of the modern, disdaining to look back. By contrast, the dyke is hurt by the order, and that names her as its problems, and wears her sense of injustice like a badge, a scar, an open wound. So, could you talk a little more about how about this figure of the dyke? I thought like Benjamin's, these allegorical figures. So certainly you are proposing a new one to understand a different possibility for modernism.
Yeah, I mean for people haven't read the book. So one of the arguments that I make in the beginning of the book is that the modern narratives about sexuality have given us these allegorical figures, and the idea is that once we were no longer governed, as Foucault tells us, by the language of sin, if it's no longer a sin to be queer, then suddenly it becomes unnatural. The language of nature took over from the language of religious disorder. And so what happens at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is that queer authors had to take up a relationship to nature. And while Wilde and what's his name who wrote Against Nature? I always confuse him with his narrator. Huysmans. And Huysmans is the author of the little yellow book that Dorian Gray carries around in The Picture of Dorian Gray. Huysmans is a French author who wrote a book, translated in English as Against Nature. And he and Oscar Wilde's sort of ideology is, if we're unnatural, we're going to accept that. And we celebrate being against nature, so much so
that we hate everything that has to do with the natural. And so camp is born. Camp is born out of this embrace of the artificial and absolute disdain for the natural. It's exactly as I said, you know, if nature hates us, we hate nature. But there's another side to that, which is the melancholic lesbian who is cast as the very emblem of unnatural woman, right? Who is not a mother, not attractive, not appealing to men, right? Who falls out of all classification. And a lot of the literature associated with lesbians, like The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, was a sort of desperate plea to be let into the category of nature. That's what The Well of Loneliness is. It's a kind of, it's like a letter to the world saying we're natural too. So the gay man, who has a much more privileged place, the dandy, says, I don't want anything to do with nature. But the lesbian at that point said, what am I? Am I nothing in the world? And that's why, you know, I'm saying, in order to really get out of this logic, we have to push beyond being against nature or wanting to be part of nature. And we have to enter this classification of wildness that is both before and after that homosexual versus heterosexual binary. And so the category of wildness is everything outside of that whole set of debates, which is many people. Like, it's not as if, you know, Havelock Ellis, Krafft Ebing, the sexologists of the 19th century, Freud, came along and offered a language and everyone immediately picked it up. There were many, many different forms of desire that people were committed to, that were not homo or hetero, and that we could also call wild. So the guy who I was telling you about with the Vulcans, T.H. White, in a letter he wrote to a friend, to a student actually, in a letter to a student, he says something like, it is very nice to go to bed with men and women, children and animals, lampposts and furniture. I mean, if someone wrote that in the contemporary context, it'd be like, this person is insane. But, and of course, it's a slightly, you know, fantastical list, but it made sense to him in a way that it does not make sense to us. So what I'm trying to get at is that the way we've organized desire is part of the problem with the colonial inscription. And I'm not saying disorder is the answer. I'm just saying that wherever there is order, there is also disorder. And disorder holds within it different kinds of information.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in this necessity of new vocabulary, do you think that it's a kind of, it's a contribution for queer studies, or you don't think more under this name of queer studies or trans studies?
Yeah, I think it is it's a way of returning to what queer studies wanted to do at the beginning, which was refuse identity categories and try to say that everything that we are is not captured by these categories that have been assigned by medical terminologies. So I think that wildness is part of a more general attempt to push out of identitarian orientations on the one hand, and to try to join queer studies to an anti-colonial project on the other.
Because I remember, I'm not mistaken, at one of your talks that you said trans is the new queer. You think it's also, I'm not sure if
well, trans asterisk, you know, when I use the term trans asterisk, I'm trying to do something similar. I use the asterisk, the star sign, that is a diacritical mark, to say trans is many different things, and the person who has transitioned medically is only one part of this much fuller definition. So, you know, I guess, you know, Denilson, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we have understood that colonialism has in part been the imposition of epistemologies, well, the work here, and this is partly was Eve Sedgwick's point, the work is to try to think outside of these epistemologies and in very obvious and common sense ways push beyond them in order to reach for new and different arrangements of the political and resistance and refusal and so on.
Okay.
I think you have a question, yeah?
Yes, I think there are some questions, but I'm not seeing them. Where are the questions? Where are Maria Lucia said that. Let me check at the
On
my WhatsApp.
That?
Let me see if it's on. just a moment. Sorry about it.
No problem.
Oh, where is it? Can you send to my? Sorry. Can you send to my to the chat? If it's not possible, I need to because I'm not on WhatsApp now. Let me. Oh my God.
Does somebody want to ask a question in person and then Aldo could translate?
Yes, I think it's in English. Oh, here it is. Sorry. So it's the other computer. It's from Gabriela Palmeira. Professor, how do you see the junctions or the intersections of queer, feminist, and Black epistemologies to, in a way, to deconstruct the colonialism as an economical system and epistemological system? Sorry, I'm just trying to translate. Is there an academic movement for that thing? I don't know if I am clear.
Okay.
In fact, the main thing is how do you see the junction of queer, feminist, and Black epistemologies? I think it's the main thing against colonialism. It's, I think, a very broad question, but anyway.
It's a broad question, but it's great because it gets at the heart of what a project like this is trying to do. It's trying to say medical and scientific language has divided up the world in ways that made sense to white colonizers, but has then imposed certain hierarchical systems on everybody else, right? And in that sense, at the beginning I said, look at the classifications of people who are cast as wild, perverse sexualities, Black people, indigenous people, colonized peoples, right? Well, that then suddenly suggests that there are also potential solidarities here that are available to us as people who have been read, scripted, studied, classified, and so on. And I do see in the last year or two, there's an increasing amount of work being done around the category of solidarity. I heard just even 4 years ago, I heard Judith Butler doing an incredible talk on solidarity. And then recently I read Veronica Gago's book, The Feminist International, in which she argues for a general strike, where she extends the category of strikers outside of just those people who are working and would stop working by recognizing that domestic labor is work. And she says, the reason that some of these radical movements in the past haven't worked is because they're made up of men, working class men who go on strike. And that then ends up being the same people who, the white working class man remains the subject of revolutionary activity, and no one else's kind of revolutionary vision is realized. So in her book, we're offered what she calls a theory of how to change everything. And I think increasingly this is what people want. And I think that's why that question, you know, is so great, because it's saying I can't say exactly how Black feminist and queer epistemologies are, you know, come together, but I can say that categories like wildness, I'm hearing a lot about the category of entanglement, categories like Saidiya Hartman's waywardness. These are new vocabularies in which we are asked to think about more than one revolutionary subject at once, or to imagine revolution, as in Saidiya Hartman's work, through the category of the Black girl in that work, or in the work of Indigenous scholars through Indigenous opposition to sovereign rule, right? Rather than waiting for white Marxist men to lead the way somewhere, right? So this is the work. This is the work, and I don't think I have any of the answers. I just offer a few terms. You know, really, it's a very modest book. In some ways, it's, I hate to say it, it's almost a conventional book, because it looks to modernism, to try to take apart how it is that certain forms of being have been constructed and cemented into place. And I'm just pointing in a few directions for how to undo that. And wildness does appeal to me anyway as one of those methods of breaking loose from classification on the one hand, and on the other hand, unmaking the world as we know it.
There is an observation from Brigida Miranda. She just said, Casement worked in the Amazon forest, and there is a contemporary Brazilian play about his life in the forest. Just in case.
Wow, okay. And do you know, yeah, okay, go ahead.
No, she doesn't mention the name, but I can find and send to you.
Yes, I mean, Casement, you know, here's the thing. When I first heard of Casement, I was at an event where a very, very cool white queer scholar was presenting on Casement. And his thing was, here's this gay guy who is the father of modern human rights. Wow, isn't this amazing? And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then I looked more into Roger Casement and I realized, well, maybe this is the problem with human rights, you know, and this is why we have a problem with human rights, because it already understands the human in a particular way, and it already understands justice through the granting of legal rights, when in fact the law, as we know, as we see right now in the US in the relationship to incredible forms of police brutality, the law is not the answer to social justice. In fact, many of us want to oppose the police and the law and work on behalf of abolition in order to achieve social transformation, right? So Casement is the example of a kind of colonial gay hero. And some people want that. There were tons of white gay men engaged in colonial activity. And Beng Lim has a book about, you know, relationships between white gay colonialists and what he calls brown boys. That's the hidden story of, you know, gay modernity, is that gay men are deeply involved in these structures of racial fetishism, sexual colonialism, sexual tourism, and so on. And so there's no salvation to be found simply by gathering together as gay, lesbian, trans people without an anti-colonial and anti-racist project. That's just going, if we don't have anti-colonial and anti-racism at the very heart of what we're doing, and an abolitionist politics, then we are just opening up new avenues of tourism for white gay men on Grindr or whatever. And women too. You know, if the racial order is kept in place, then change is not possible. So I would be really interested to hear about that play and whether it was a critique of Casement's activities in the Amazon, or whether it was admiring of Casement. And he deserves both, but it has to be both.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question from Thais Severo. Professor Halberstam, you have worked with the concept of queer time, queer temporalities in the past. What would be the relation between queer temporalities and your concept of wild? It seems to me that the wild isn't only a state before domestication, before colonization, but in itself a time that prepares every existence.
Yeah, thank you, Thais. That's I mean, it's a beautifully perceptive question that, as I even said in the little passage I read, it's not just where the wild things are, but when the wild things are. And so at one point, I really engage with ideas about indigenous peoples as being part of the past. I mean, this is the way in which wildness is situated in relationship to temporality. Wildness is in the past, right? Just think of Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, this idea that before the nation state, the countries are just wild, filled with struggle of all against all. And the idea is that we need this kind of ordering force in order to pull society into the modern on the one hand, and into under the surveillance of law and order. And what we find now is that law and order is in fact the problem. Law and order is the problem. And of course, in colonial discourse, wildness is in the past. But in the kind of work that I'm doing, I contest this idea that wildness is in the past, just as we might want to contest that indigenous people are only situated in the past. And we want to disturb these temporal regimes that assign pastness to certain racial subjects, and that then pose whiteness as a kind of futurity. It's really important, in fact, to disturb that temporal logic with a kind of wild temporality as well. And so wildness in my book is very much something that is yet to come, in that kind of Jose Munoz idea of a utopian horizon that is always out there and is never in the here and now, but is something that we can think with and work towards without the expectation of arrival per se.
I think there are two questions that can be mixed. One is from Cynthia Francisca. So, given the book's goal of expanding our critical vocabulary on wildness, have you reviewed indigenous understandings or indigenous experience of wildness or otherness? And the other question is, I think it's related. It's from our colleague, Liv Sovic. The iconography of the classic children's book, Where the Wild Things Are, looks colonial. The tropics where wild things dwell is the dream dominion of a white child king. Perhaps I misunderstand what you are doing, please say. But I wonder whether new lexicons that are not found on communities of experience are not ultimately too slippery to be useful.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to say that clearly this is a conceptual book. I'm not an Indigenous studies scholar, but yes, you know, I've tried to not say this is how Indigenous people would understand this category. Obviously, this category has been deeply troubling and problematic for Indigenous groups who have been grouped under its heading and then subjected to modern discipline in the forms of incarceration, forced education, adoption, uprooting, removal, all of those things, right? So the category of the wild to an Indigenous person is necessarily an antagonistic category. I do understand that. I'm not disputing that. But I am saying that nonetheless, the wild is a fairly capacious category. And to the extent that it has been used as an insult, it remains to be seen whether it can still offer some kind of response as well. So and I think that within different kinds of cosmologies, this distinction between wild and domestic just doesn't hold in the same way. Wild and domestic is an utterly colonial binary. It really is. But it doesn't mean that there isn't something in the category of wildness that we might not be able to hold on to. So let's try. The question about where the wild things are, yes. It is a colonial narrative. It is the white child who fantasizes about the jungle where they will go and they will be king. It is a colonial narrative. Yes, that was my point. And my point is that when children are read this narrative, and it is a beloved narrative, the root of connection is between the wildness of the child and the wildness of an elsewhere. But we have to now try to pull apart, the wildness of the child, the wildness of the elsewhere from the colonial frame within which Max at the end goes home, or that Max is always going to be the king of the wild things. Max is the sovereign subject. We don't want access to the wild through Max. We want access to the wild through the wild things. And that is what modern literature denies us, right, in many different ways. And that's where my book would end. And there would be opening onto different kinds of literatures and cultures in which we do not have to access indigenous work simply by going through the canonical text. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pry apart the canonical texts for the kind of extractive practices they have engaged in relationship to indigenous material.
So a question from Pedro Pinheiro Neves. You mentioned the very curious relationship between falconry and gay male BDSM. Is there any similar relationship between women's sexual expressions and animal identifications? I'm reminded of the end of the story of O, where O is transformed into a hybrid woman-wolf statue, both a wild animal and a highly artificial creation.
That's such a good question. There's a book by a woman through which I first encountered this phenomenon by which supposedly gay men were writing about falconry. And that book is H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. It's a beautiful book. It's a gorgeous book. It was a very, very big best-selling book in England about 5 years ago. And it tells the story of a woman who, it is Helen MacDonald's story. Her father dies and she's in mourning. And in order to mourn her father, she decides to get a falcon and train it. And this training regime allows her to mourn. It's, because really falconry it's like a Freudian definition of mourning and melancholia. It really is. It's like you let the bird go and then it comes back. You let it go and then it comes back. It's the game of Fort da in Freud, by which he claims that the child learns to live with absence, that something goes away, but it will come back. And she has to let go of the bird at the end to realize that she must let go of the father. Okay, so it's a very conventional narrative. But the narrative is interspersed with her account of T.H. White and his book, The Goshawk. And in it, we learn about his failed attempt to train his hawk. And Helen MacDonald, and this is the one part of the book that I'm critical of, she thinks that because T.H. White could never come out of the closet as a gay man, he engages in a kind of S&M ritual with this bird and punishes the bird for desires he can never express. And my point is that it? I don't think so. I think his desire is precisely for the feral, for the wildness, the fierceness that is represented by the bird. And you can see then why this would be a male narrative, because, first of all, falconry is almost always historically a male art. In fact, when you train the bird, it's called manning the bird. To get control of the bird is to man it, is to dominate it. It's understood to be a male art. And of course, women are often located in relationship to the domestic. So they are not somehow close to the wild. That said, there are lots of narratives about women and animals. Even The Well of Loneliness has a narrative in it about Stephen Gordon and her horse. And the horse is more important to her than any human relationship. And in fact, women are seen, you see, this is the problem. Women are already seen as closer to animals within a natural order of things. They're both the representation of the domestic in a human order, but they are closer to animals in a hierarchical order of things within which the man is, at the top of the food chain. So yes, there are such narratives in which lesbians are sort of articulating deep love for their animals, but none that have the same sort of fetishistic quality of these falconry stories.
And there is a question from Camila Macedo. Professor, could you talk a little more? Please, could you talk a little more about the idea of ferox, how it works? It seems that in your proposal, it's an alternative to epistemology of the closet.
Yeah. I was trying to find that passage that I couldn't find. Yeah.
It's page 18. When
18?
No, not 18, sorry.
80. No? Yeah, the epistemology of the closet, but there's a quote.
Yes, I think I saw this too.
Okay. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So, okay, let me talk a little bit more about the ferox. Yes, absolutely. When I read Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, it was the first time I found out that T.H. White had written this book, The Goshawk. I knew his other books. I didn't know The Goshawk. And I was bothered, that Helen Macdonald kept casting him as a kind of, as a pervert against whom she identified as a normal person. And she was very critical of T.H. White for being a teacher in a boarding school, for having fantasies about young boys, for being into S&M. All of this he records in his diaries. But she was most interested in this book about the goshawk. And I feel that she just didn't quite know what to do with some of the material that she found. So let me just read this passage. So in The Goshawk, a memoir and a love story as much as anything, and this is me speaking now, White seeks for a language for his love for the untamable bird, and he finds it in a description that he reads of the tendency of goshawks in training to revert quickly and decisively, in the words of one author, to a feral state. For White, this is the thrilling concept, a reminder of the wildness that cannot be drained out of the bird, and it is therefore the source of its appeal. White identifies with the bird even as he seeks to master it. He proposes that he too would like to return to a feral state, and he writes, the word feral had a kind of magical potency, which allied itself with two other words, ferocious and free. Fairy, fey, aerial, and other discreditable alliances range themselves behind the great chord of ferox. That's what White says. Now, these are really interesting words. And first of all, he calls it the great chord of ferox, which I love this concept. But look at the words that he pulls together. And remember, I'm interested in these other lexicons. He says there are two other words, ferocious, I'll say something about that in a moment, and free, freedom. Free is interesting here, right? Particularly if we're trying to also think in terms of a kind of Black investment in wildness. Three other words, fairy, which is absolutely identified with gay sexuality. Fey is an English word, old English word, that used to mean the agitated state that someone gets into right before they die, which is a really weird word, fey. But in contemporary usage, it means a gay man. You say he's really fey. If you say somebody's really fey, you mean that they are effeminate. And what's the sign of their effeminacy? They move around too much. They don't have the discipline of masculinity, okay? Fey. And then aerial, which is sort of, I guess, kind of spacey. So these are super interesting words, but I want to return to the ferox and the ferocious. The last part of this chapter, and I didn't mention this, is I go to the poems of Langston Hughes. And I suggest that there is a way in which the language of the ferox has infiltrated contemporary gay culture. And it is through Black slang. And in Black slang, the word fierce is a way of talking about gay culture. It's a slang word in gay culture. She's fierce, usually is applied to a drag queen, for example. So I wanted to know why fierce, you know? And so I did a little bit of digging, and even in the poems of Langston Hughes, who famously was quite reticent to talk about his own homosexuality, he himself uses the language of freedom, fierceness, and the bird of prey, the eagle, to offers them as a kind of allegorical poem about gayness. So fierceness is part of a subterranean language used by gay men, primarily, specifically in the 20th century by Black men, to indicate a form of, a wild form of desire on the one hand, but also a really fierce is like a radical form of opposition on the other. So there are many connections to be made here to the category of the ferox that feels to me more capacious and more radically ambitious than the closet.
Okay, I think it's a last question. If you could talk a little bit about your second book, On the Wild. Yeah. It's going to come out this year? Or it's
No, but it's close actually, because I was this is the thing. I was writing it as one book. Mm-hmm. And you can see even from this presentation, this is a messy book. It's like falcons and Project Casement and zombies and pets, right? Because that's what the wild is. The wild is many different things that don't seem like they should belong together, right? And then the second half of the book was supposed to be about these very specific aesthetic practices engaged in unmaking the world. And in there I had an architecture, the form of unbuilding that's associated with the work of Gordon Matta Clark, who was a Chilean immigrant to the US and who went to architecture school and then engaged in a whole series in the 1970s of performance pieces where he unbuilt buildings. I also looked at the work of a Black photographer, Alvin Baltrop, who took gorgeous pictures of gay men cruising in the piers. But more importantly than the gay men cruising were these gorgeous images of the piers collapsing, and he called them collapsed architectures. And then there are chapters on music. There's a chapter on Jay-Z and Kanye West's anthem, No Church in the Wild. There's a chapter on lesbian experiments with sound by the work of people like Pauline Oliveros. And there's a chapter on autodestructive art that is intended to be a critique of the burgeoning art market in the 1970s. It's very much a 1970s book. It's an anarchist book. It's a book that says, in these aesthetic practices from the 1970s, we can find wild forms of anarchist desire that are pointing the way to different futures. And so it was sort of the utopian piece to the very melancholic piece. But the book was too crazy to have all of that in one book. So I had to make the decision to separate into two books. But I'm really enjoying the second book. It's much more my speed in a way, in the sense that it's not about the canon and the tradition and how to, dig the wild out of the colonial artifacts. It's much more about these renegade queer forms of world unbuilding that I think are a legacy of the punk cultures of the 70s that we should return to.
Well, that's great. Well, I think it's a pity, but it was good that your computer didn't fail too. No?
We made it. We made it between the two screens, yes.
So I'm very glad that you could come. It's a pity that you couldn't come in person last year, when the translation was released.
Yeah.
But we are really glad that you could come to talk to us, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everybody, and here's hoping that maybe within the next year we'll all see each other in person. So
Yes.
Good luck. Thank you so much. Thank you, Denilson. Thank you, Aldo.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.